All right, so you're ready to dive into something kind of surprising? We're tackling Christian views on marriage. And trust me, it's way more diverse than people think.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to assume there's one Christian stance on marriage, but history tells a different story.
You got that right. You sent over these excerpts from Wikipedia on Christian marriage and this article from the Family Research Council, and I gotta say, even just glancing at them, there's a lot to unpack.
Right. It's not as simple as you might think.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Like, did you know that in the early church, some major figures like Tertullian and Jerome actually thought celibacy was the more, like, spiritually superior path?
Yeah, that's a far cry from what you hear preached in most churches today.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? But it makes you wonder, how do we get from that point to where marriage is seen as this sacred, essential thing across Christianity?
It was definitely a gradual shift. Over time, the idea of marriage as a sacrament really took hold, especially within Catholicism. By the 12th century, it was formally recognized as one of their seven sacraments, this unbreakable, holy union meant for the good of the couple and for having and raising kids.
So it went from being a personal agreement to, like, this divinely ordained institution.
Precisely. And that view still shapes how Catholics see things like divorce and the whole purpose of marriage.
That makes sense.
But even though Protestants don't view marriage as a sacrament in the exact same way, they still hold it in high regard. They see it as a holy institution established by God.
So we're already seeing some key differences, right? Like, even within Christianity, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to marriage. This is where it gets really interesting. So we're already seeing how diverse these views on marriage can be. Even within Christianity, it's like you say Christian marriage, and it can mean a whole bunch of different things depending on who you're talking to.
Exactly.
So we touched on the Catholic view, but what about Protestants? How do they approach marriage?
Well, with Protestants, you see a wider range of beliefs, especially when it comes to things like divorce and family planning.
Like how many kids you're supposed to have, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Because that's a big one, right?
Oh, definitely. Some Protestant denominations are very strict about divorce, only allowing it in really extreme cases, like if there's infidelity. But others are more flexible, recognizing that relationships are complicated and life can throw you curveballs.
It's like they're trying to balance those traditional beliefs with the realities of modern life.
Right. And then when it comes to family size, you have some Protestant groups who are totally fine with using contraception to plan their families.
Makes sense.
But then you have others who believe in natural family planning. And then there are groups like Quiverful, where the idea is to have as many children as God gives you without using any form of birth control.
Wow. So you've got the whole spectrum represented there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have Eastern Orthodoxy, which has its own unique perspective on all of this.
Yeah, they always seem to approach marriage with like an extra layer of symbolism or something.
They do. In Eastern Orthodoxy, marriage is seen as this icon, this reflection of Christ's love for the church.
Oh, I see.
And that's really beautifully represented in their marriage ceremony with the whole crowning ritual and everything.
I've always loved that imagery. It's so powerful and visual, It really drives home the sacredness of what's happening.
Exactly. And that emphasis on marriage as a representation of a divine union, it influences a lot of their views on things like, say, interfaith marriages or even remarriage after divorce. Those tend to be approached with a lot more strictness in Eastern Orthodoxy.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about what Christian marriage is seen as, like a sacrament, a covenant, that kind of thing. And we've talked about the purpose of marriage from these different Christian perspectives. But what about the practical side of things? Like, how does each branch of Christianity view the roles of husbands and wives within a marriage?
Yeah, that's a big one, and it's definitely a source of a lot of debate, even within denominations.
Right, like who's in charge, so to speak?
Well, yeah, and it really all centers on how different groups interpret certain passages in the Bible, particularly the ones that talk about the husband as the head of the wife.
Oh, right, like those verses in Ephesians.
Exactly.
But even that word head can be interpreted in so many ways, which is probably why you see such a range of beliefs about like authority and leadership within a marriage, right?
Exactly.
So we've got all these different ways to interpret that idea of the husband as the head. What are some of the main perspectives we see within Christianity today?
Well, one big one is egalitarianism. Egalitarians believe that husbands and wives share authority and responsibility in the marriage.
Okay, so it's more about partnership.
Right. They emphasize mutual submission, but it's based on love and respect, not on, like, a hierarchy.
That makes sense.
And they often point to Galatians 3:28, where Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So for them, that verse really highlights the spiritual equality between men and women, and they believe that applies to marriage rules as well.
That makes sense. So what about the other side of the coin? What about those who see a clear distinction between the roles of husbands and wives?
Right, so then you have complementarians. And they also believe that men and women are equal in worth, but they think that God has designed specific roles for husbands and wives within marriage.
And those roles complement each other, hence the name.
Exactly. For them, the husband's role is one of leadership, but they're very clear that this isn't about one spouse being better or more capable than the other. It's about recognizing these divinely appointed differences in how they function and what they're responsible for within the marriage.
So they might point to passages like that one in 1 Corinthians that talks about the husband as the head of the wife.
Yeah, exactly. They often cite 1 Corinthians 11:3, where Paul says, "But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." Okay, so they see that as support for their view.
Right. But again, they emphasize that it's not about one being over the other in like a power struggle kind of way.
It's about fulfilling those God-given roles within a loving, supportive marriage.
Yes, exactly. And then you have those who take the complementarian view a step further. We're talking about biblical patriarchy.
Yeah, and that's where this Family Research Council article comes in, right?
Exactly. Biblical patriarchy argues for male authority, not just in the home, but also in society as a whole. They see those headship passages as applying to like broader social structures as well.
It's important to note that's definitely a more conservative stance and not necessarily representative of all Christians or even all complementarians, right?
Absolutely. It's a viewpoint that tends to spark a lot of discussion and, honestly, some controversy, too.
For sure. But one thing that really stood out to me is that regardless of where people stand on this whole headship issue, all our sources agree that a wife should never submit to her husband if it means going against God. Right. That's crucial. Both spouses are ultimately called to submit to Christ above all else.
It's a good reminder that no matter how we interpret those specific roles within marriage, there's always a bigger picture.
Definitely. It's like Christian marriage, in all its different forms, it always points to something beyond the two individuals involved.
It's about reflecting God's love, God's purpose.
Exactly. It's about reflecting a divine reality.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? I mean, we went from celibacy in the early church to the ins and outs of different denominations' views on marriage roles today.
And we didn't even have time to get into everything.
Right. But I think the takeaway here is that Christian views on marriage are anything but simple.
They're complex, they're multifaceted, and honestly, probably still evolving even as we speak.
For sure. But that's what makes exploring these topics so interesting, right? So for anyone listening who wants to keep wrestling with these ideas, here's something to chew on. If marriage, in all its different expressions, is supposed to reflect something about God, what does that tell us about who God is and how we relate to God? It's a question worth pondering.